Well, thank you all for coming so early in the morning. This is a session about history, and I'm going to start with talking about India. The title of the paper is Community Origins of Industrial. So why do we care? Why do we want to think about Indian industrialization? The early industrialization literature basically thinks about prerequisites of industrialization. So for example, the Industrial Revolution in Britain, that in Germany, or the United States. Work by Joel Mokyr, Douglas North, and Weingast focus on the role of property rights that allowed technological development and therefore industrialization quite independent of the state. The later industrializers, such as the United States and Germany, use the state more as a vehicle of industrialization. So for example, tariffs in the United States, the state as an entrepreneur in Russia, the developmental states in East Asia. So our question was that what happens when the institutional setting is missing and the state doesn't really play a supportive role? The context is pre-independence colonial India, when the state was much more interested in exporting British industrial goods to India rather than developing local industries. In fact, Lancashire tried actively to stifle any type of industrialization. But nevertheless, from the middle of the 19th century, a pretty large cotton textile sector developed. So our question is, how did this happen? So one possible channel we can think of is the role of community networks. The role of community networks is widely discussed in the context of trade. For example, the work by Avner Greif. It's also discussed in the context of development economics, role of community networks in credit and insurance, in labor markets, and so on. Our context is quite different. It's the context of industrialization. And the way we want to think of the role of communities is the way in which they exchange information, exchange know-how, share information, and then overcome problems of contractual moral hazard. So in this paper, what we are going to do is look at two different industries. The cotton textile industry in the late 19th century and the jute textile industry in just after the First World War. We create a completely new data set of entrepreneurs who were present in these two industries right from 1850. And we are going to use the American Civil War as a natural experiment to look at the role of entrance at this period on the following development of the industries in the two sectors. So one is going to use the American Civil War as a natural experiment, and for jute, we are going to use the context of the First World War. We have a simple model in the paper, which I'm not going to talk about now, given the constraint of time. And we are going to analyze the entry of entrepreneurs over time, controlling for community fixed effects and year fixed effects. So think of what alternative explanations might be there. There are several out there in the literature. One is the work by John Sutton, where he looks at development of skills in an upstream industry which allows entry into the downstream. Then there's work by Karl Marx, and then also the same idea is present in the work of Banerjee and Newman, where wealth accumulation in pre-industrial activity is important for industrialization. In our explanation, what is going to matter is the spillovers within the communities. It's not going to be wealth or skill necessarily. It's going to be these spillovers which are generated within the communities. The empirical strategy is really simple. What we are going to look at is the downstream of the cotton textile industry. And we are going to have an initial stock of entrepreneurs during the Civil War. And then we are going to estimate the network effect in terms of the endogenously evolving network effects with reference to this initial stock. And then we are going to control for community fixed effects and year fixed effects. A summary of the findings is as follows, in case I don't get to the end. There is no direct evidence that pre-industrial wealth accumulation or skill formation actually mattered, but there is very robust evidence of a network effect. So one additional entrepreneur in the initial stock generated 4.4 additional entrepreneurs in 1890. And this concentration of communities at the level of the firm continued even when we go all the way up to 1930. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on Indian industrialization. So this is a kind of, a typical case of global, a completely free global economy, which was colonial, and therefore had access to the British capital market and other markets internationally. The British investment that flowed into India was in very specific sectors. It was in railways, infrastructure, it was in tea, and it was in jute as well. So these are the sectors where British investment dominated. When we look at the major input substituting industry, which is the cotton textile industry, which is a very large sector, it is almost entirely Indian capital. I mean, that doesn't mean British capital wasn't present, but it's really quite small. And these two, the industrial centers in India were in two different spaces. On the western side, near Bombay, is the place where the cotton textile industry developed. And then we moved to the east, near Calcutta, which is where the jute industry developed. And these two regions are very much separated in terms of ownership. Western India was dominated by Indian capital and Eastern India by British capital. That's the kind of share of different sectors in investment. I'm going to just, go through it quite quickly. So how did the cotton textile industry begin to grow? It started to emerge as an indigenous industry, quite separate from the traditional weaving industry, which was there for many centuries. It started from 1850, first in Bombay, and then it spread to Ahmedabad, which is a city close to Bombay. And the two cities were located in the region of the Bombay Presidency. There were two segments of this industry. One is upstream, and the upstream was essentially buying raw cotton from the producers, baling them into forms which can be then shipped to the UK or used in the domestic market. And the downstream is when this raw cotton was woven into thread, was spun into thread, and then woven into cloth. So the two sectors are quite different, and we are going to study them separately and focus on the downstream today because it is a sector which required more capital and was much more complex. We are going to focus on mainly on Bombay in this presentation. So how did the industry actually develop during the Civil War? From 1850, one or two entrepreneurs from the trading communities in Bombay were present in this sector. When the US Civil War started, the exports of raw cotton from the US to Britain were stopped. So the entire supply source shifted to India, and there was a big increase in baling activity in this period, leading to the emergence of the upstream sector. When the Civil War ended, the source of supply shifted back to the US, and this fall in the profitability of the upstream sector led to a big increase in entry into the downstream. This happened despite the absence of capital markets. This happened despite any kind of state intervention by providing supportive tariffs. So that's a picture you can see. This is the downstream. You can see the entry during the Civil War and the flattening out after that. These are stocks of firms. And this is the downstream where there are some firms in the Civil War. This number is really small. And then that increasing very rapidly in the following years. This is what the two sectors look like, and that's why we want to focus on the downstream. This is the upstream where you can see raw cotton, which is then being processed into bales, and this sector looks pretty, simple, right? It doesn't require any fancy technology. And this is the first downstream mill that was set up in Bombay in 1854, a much more complicated industry requiring imported capital goods from Britain. So we can think in terms of the role of the community in the following ways. One is we can think of the community as a source of capital. In India, the banks did not provide, there were some banks in Bombay and Calcutta and elsewhere, they did not provide any long-term capital. They provided some short-term capital. There was no formal stock market up to 1875. Even when the stock market was set up, most of the firms borrowed from the community members. So they would sell their shares to members of the community, and there's enough anecdotal evidence on that. And so the capital market remained highly segmented despite the presence of a stock exchange. We can also think of the community as a source of contract enforcement. So again, the institutions were pretty weak in India. There was no civil code for contract enforcement. Everything was a criminal offense. So until 1872, even when the legislation was passed, the firms continued to rely on their communities to enforce contractual obligations. This was also a period of free trade within the British Empire. So trade was free from India to Britain due to some kind of revenue purposes. A tariff rate of 3 to 5% was imposed on cotton textiles. Lancashire lobbied to get countervailing excise of the same rate. So the net tariff on Indian industries at this point was actually 0. And this continued to be the case right up to 1950s. There were some prominent communities here. There were 5 different trading communities coming from different caste and religious backgrounds. The first were the Parsis, a very special entrepreneurial group who migrated from Persia to India in the 8th century. The Bhatiyas, a Hindu community, a very small Hindu community which was quite progressive in terms of social values. The Khoja Muslims, again a small sector within a sect within the Muslim community. The Baghdadi Jews, the Europeans, and then 2 Hindu groups, the Jains and the Vanyas. And we treat them as one group because not just that they were very similar in terms of their involvement in the economic sectors, but they also intermarried. So we are going to treat them as one community. All these communities were involved in some kind of pre-industrial activity. Either it was cotton trade, or it was money lending, or it was interaction as agents of or brokers of the East India Company. So their outside options were different, which may have influenced their time of entry into the cotton textile industry. So when we look at the entry at the entrepreneur level, these are stocks of entrepreneurs. You can see this is the stock of entrepreneurs in the Civil War rising over time. And now when we break it down by community, you can see one community emerges as the biggest group in a pretty nonlinear fashion, and that's the Parsis. There are other groups too, but you can see the pattern of entry is pretty nonlinear over time. So the main assumption in identifying the network effect is going to be as follows. We are going to assume that the community characteristics do not vary in a nonlinear way, and they do not vary across communities. The levels may be different. So that's the main assumption of the paper, and I'm going to show you some supportive evidence or suggestive evidence that this is indeed the case. So the network effect is going to depend on this nonlinear increase in the stock, community stock, given the initial stock of entrepreneurs. So here's some evidence on how literacy varied across communities, and you can see that the Parsis were by far the more literate, most literate of all the groups, but they don't change over time in different ways. So there is a community-specific trend, but that's not good. The nonlinearity is not going to come from education or population. So these are the population of the different communities in Bombay City. So let me say a little bit about the data. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Okay. So the data comes from business registers and almanacs, and it's available from 1840 by sector. And it's from the 3 cities, Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. We extract at the firm level, we extract the names of every entrepreneur in a firm who are either directors or partners in a firm. Each of these entrepreneurs are then assigned a community from their names. And the firms are also classified by community depending on majority of the directors. And we have annual data from 1860 to 1910, and then we have 5-yearly data all the way up to 1955. So this is what the data looks like. You can see this is a Parsi firm. This guy is clearly a Parsi. This guy is a Parsi. This guy is a Parsi. This guy is a Parsi. So this is clearly a Parsi firm. And we classify the firm as a Parsi firm as well. Okay, so 2 things I'm going to talk about in terms of descriptive statistics. One is going to be, did past experience matter? And the idea is that, was presence in a upstream activity required for entry into the downstream? And this is what you find, that the light part of the bar is people who had no upstream experience. And you can see that's the majority of the entrepreneurs. So it's not necessary that you required some kind of upstream experience to enter as an entrepreneur into the cotton textile industry. The second thing I'm going to show you now is the matching at entry. That is, when an entrepreneur entered, did this entrepreneur go to a firm of the same community or to a firm of a different community? And here, again, you'll see very high concentration. This is different communities, so about 40, under 40% of the entrepreneurs went to a firm of a different communities, and that proportion by 90 is even smaller. So the largest overwhelming number of entrepreneurs went to a firm that belonged to the same community. This is the equation that we estimate. So this is the stock of entrepreneurs at time t. Depends on the initial stock interacted with the time trend square. And then there are community-specific fixed effects, time effects, and so on. The initial stock has variation. You can see the initial stock in upstream and the initial stock in downstream. There's kind of quite a lot of variation by community. Now, if you look at the estimates that we have, the interaction term is strongly significant. So the higher the number of members of a community in the initial stock, the larger is the number over time. And this is robust to different specification. As we change the dummies and control for different community-specific effects, we still find the effect to be pretty robust. Now what we do is we extend the period to 1890. From 1890 to 1910, here something actually changes quite dramatically. Most of the entry after 1890 actually happens in the city of Ahmedabad, which is several hundred miles away from Bombay. And here, what is different as well, the communities which become important are not the same ones who are present in Bombay. So the main communities, Ahmedabad, are different communities. These are the Vanya communities and the Jains. And the reason they enter at this point, we think, is that money lending regulations come in the 1870s, which make money lending more risky compared to before. So we see a big entry of these money lenders into the cotton textile industry. They also become the largest group. So this is the green line. You see them in 70, 1880, 1890, they're pretty small, and then suddenly they enter in a major way. Okay, thanks. I'm going to break it down between the two cities. This is Bombay. You see, this is the main entry point, and the Parsis kind of stabilize after that. You can think in terms of the number of possible entrepreneurs are limited. In the paper, we kind of assume population doesn't matter, but this may not be the case. And this is Ahmedabad, where you see everything is quite flat, and then there is a sudden increase in entry, and this is from a different community. So can we then estimate the same thing for Ahmedabad as well, for the later period? And the answer to that is no, because the initial stock of the Civil War is no longer the relevant initial stock, because the community that has come in is different. It's a new location, the groups are new. So what we are going to do is we are just going to show you some descriptive statistics to show that the same pattern actually still continues. And this is people entering with upstream experience. Again, you can see that number is pretty small. It's really small by 1910. If you look at when they enter, do they go to a firm of the same community or not? You can see that, you can see that this actually, the number of same community matching is really big in Ahmedabad, and it increases over time. So we still observe very community-specific effects within firms, even when we extend the period. So these are the summary of results. There's not much evidence of a prior experience in entry. There is a pretty solid experience of matching in firms by community, and there's robust evidence of network effect on, it's kind of a multiplier on the incumbent stocks. So one entrepreneur, additional entrepreneur during the Civil War had led to 4.4 more entrepreneurs in 1890. Okay, do I have time, 2-3 minutes? Okay, so I'm just going to show you the jute industry and what happened there. And it's a very different industry, because this was a British-dominated industry. There were literally a handful of Indian entrepreneurs in different British firms. But during the First World War, the British firm began to borrow from the Marwari traders. So there were many Indians who became shareholders in British firms and gradually became directors in this firm. So there was an increase in entrepreneurship from the Indian communities during the First World War. And basically, there were two communities present. These were, again, different communities, the Bengalis and the Marwaris in the upstream. It's only the Marwaris who entered the downstream. And again, if you see the pattern, you can see there's an increase, there's a stock, there's an increase. Splitting up by community, it's the Marwaris which increase significantly over time. And then we do the same thing in estimating the network effect, and I'll show you this is what our key variable is, initial stock minus multiplied by time to n square. Again, this is a variable which is positive and significant. So even in jute, which is a very different industry, we find very strong effects of the network, even when the ownership kind of passes from British to Indian entrepreneurs. And here is some evidence of community matching. You can see that matching is less strong in the jute industry compared to cotton, and that because the way of entry was different. It was through buying shares rather than setting up new firms. Some new firms were set up, but those were fewer. And if you extend the time, you can see that there are lots of the strength of the concentration is much lower. So in conclusion, we think that community networks were important in early industrialization in India, when the institutions were not present to create the right incentives, and the state did not play a supporting role. There were different communities in jute and cotton textile industries in the downstream in different locations. We don't find evidence of the upstream experience playing a big role, but we do find significant evidence of robust network effect in both these industries. And we think this is some kind of spillovers through communication and information sharing through the network in this period. Thank you. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, we know who the managers were. We don't include them in the category of entrepreneurs. So in this firm, the manager is British, but in many Parsi firms, the managers are not British because the Parsis were quite literate. But your point is particularly valid for firms such as Vania firms, or where the literacy level was not that high and experience was not that high. There, the managers were often either British or Parsi, and it's something we haven't really looked at, but we can think of looking at that. Thank you. Yeah.
Should we think of previous upstream experience as a measure of quality of the output? Because we see that share decreases over time, whereas the community, sort of within the community increases. So it's the kind of strength of the community in some sense, allowing less skilled workers. Is that what we see?
No, absolutely. So we can think of pioneers who are coming from the upstream, and they are there in the initial stock, right? But then over time, people who they draw in are not those who have any experience. They clearly have wealth. We don't know where that wealth comes from because we tried to link them to all kinds of trading names we have, but we couldn't find much evidence. So that we think is a pure network effect, that they come in because somebody in the community tells them this is a profitable enterprise, so come in. Yeah. Okay.
All right, good morning also from my side. I'm Fabian Zioda, and today I present Disease and Demographic Development, the Legacy of the Black Death, which is joint work with Uwe Sunde from the University of Munich. So what we're really interested in is how long-run development happens. And what is pretty clear in unified growth is that the economic transition is closely connected to the demographic transition, essentially the idea that people decide to have fewer children but invest more in their human capital. So, and while that is pretty clear from theory, and there's a lot of evidence for that, it is not so clear what actually determines the timing of the demographic transition. And this is what we try to contribute. And our idea is that population shocks might have triggered the onset of the demographic transition. So how does that work? Well, think of the world as a Malthusian stage. So every time that you are somewhat richer, you decide to have more children, and you have no increase in living conditions for essentially centuries. There has been evidence by Voigtländer and Vogt, who used the plague as a population shock, which essentially shifts the population from one Malthusian regime to another. So the way that this works is that the plague hits you, half the population dies, land-to-labor ratios increase, you're now much richer, so you decide to not only produce your agricultural goods, but you also consume industrially produced goods, which are produced in the cities, so people move to the cities to produce those goods, and that leads to higher population share in the city, so increased urbanization and higher living standards in the cities and also on the countryside. And ultimately, that sets the stage essentially for a shift, as in Galo Wild, to demographic transition, because at some point your living standards are high enough to do that, and population density is high enough to trigger that. So we look at the Black Death and population shock. Unlike Fortland and Ford, who only look at the plague at a one-time shock, we look at repeated plague outbreaks throughout time. But for simplicity, we just I wanted to give you like an overall introduction of the Black Death in Europe, like the very big plague outbreak that everyone usually refers to as the Black Death. It was the plague outbreak in 1347. It was winter of 1347 to 1348, and then it spread throughout Europe like crazy. 30 to 40% of the European population died. There is a lot of regional variation. So some regions it was up to 60%, other region where it was quite less affected. So, and our argument is that the Black Death is essentially an exogenous shock that affected the timing of the demographic transition through the effect of population shocks. So, there's still a lot of debate on how the plague breakouts happen. So there are two ideas of how this happens. So the first idea is that there was one plague introduction in 1348, and then there were local plague reservoirs, and every once in a while there was a random breakout. So that might be true. It's still not even clear where those local reservoirs are. There is evidence that the plague can survive in soil for quite some time and then spread out. Other evidence suggests that it might be close to the seawater because the plague bacteria is resistant to seawater. So most likely there are reservoirs and they are close to the ocean. Another theory is that they were constantly reintroduced from Asia, so that they depend on weather conditions in Mongolia, and that they can be traced back to the weather conditions in Mongolia. That is by Schmidt et al. But regardless of what version you choose to believe, our story worked with both. Because as soon as you have a plague outbreak in a maritime region, the plague spreads through human contact, mostly via trade, to other cities, and people get affected there. And the plague intensity decreases with the distance to maritime ports, because it spreads concentrically. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the plague introductions to Europe. So those are the main ports. So if you have a number assigned to the port, that's what Schmidt et al. Referred to as a reintroduction. If you don't believe the story of reintroductions from Asia, think of it as a plague outbreak where there hasn't been a plague outbreak within a 500-kilometer radius on land and a 1,000-kilometer radius on sea for 2 years beforehand. So that's a new plague wave. It may come from a local reservoir, it may come from Asia, it doesn't really matter for our story, but it's just a new plague outbreak that spread through Europe. Okay, so we use 3 strategies to test our hypothesis. Is there water? Okay, so first we use OLS, then we use a reduced form, and I will talk more about why we do that in a moment. And then we also use an IV. So let's talk a little bit about the data that we use. So for the demographic transition, we use Knodel. They're part of the European Fertility Project. So they collect data on marital fertility because it's much better measured than overall fertility relative to Hutterites. So what this essentially gives you is the number of births that you have relative to the number of births you could have had given your age population, the age distribution of your population. We have 237 cities in Germany, and the demographic transition happened between 1871 and 1939. The plague data that we use is pretty much the plague data that everyone uses. It's BRBN. And we use a lot of control variables, mostly from Cantoni 2012, and then land suitability by Gallo and Özak. And Also, we used the city records for war events, because the 30-year war was a big event in Europe. But I will talk all about that a little bit more when I give you an overview of the results. Okay. So this is the variation in the timing of the fertility transition. So the darker it gets, the later the fertility transition was. This is just to give you a general idea of how that looks. And if you're confused by the map of Germany, this is Germany with the borders of 1900, because that's when the plague outbreak happened. So a lot of what is here now is now considered Poland. But yeah. Okay, so this is just our very, very preliminary results. Here we just use regular OLS, regress the number of plague outbreaks from the Bureau Band data set on the year of the demographic transition. And we get significant negative results throughout all our specifications. So we continuously include controls. So the first one is just without any controls. Then we add controls for geography, essentially whether there's a lake nearby, a river nearby. Then we have controls for population in column 3. Column 3. Essentially means the population densities before the plague outbreaks and population growth before then. We have controls for religion, because a lot of theory predicts that Protestant regions had the fertility transition earlier than Catholic regions. We control for institutions. We control for agriculture, and also for wars. Basically, whether the city has been affected by the 30-year war or the 7-year war. So our results are significant throughout all specifications. So there is a little problem with the plague data. So I have recorded some plague outbreaks myself from city records, and the problem you have when you look at those is that you open them, and then it says people die. So no one really knows what that is. Why do people die? How many people died? Some people even write down how many people died, but then you don't know. Do they count women and children? Do they count them half? Do they count only people in the city limits or outside? So the data is essentially a mess, and and there is a lot of evidence, a lot of people writing about how you should not really use that data for scientific purposes. So as I hinted already earlier, so we use a proxy strategy. So we proxy the plague outbreaks by the travel time from those plague ports, and we also use an instrument to instrument the plague outbreaks. And I will now talk a little more into detail on how we do that. So we use geographic data. So what we start with is a travel network of 8 million roads, 2 million river segments of today's road network. Then we delete all the roads and all the road structures that haven't been there in medieval times, bridges, canals, tunnels, all of that is gone. And then we calculate the slope of all those roads. Because the steeper it is, the harder it is to travel, especially during medieval times. What we end up with is a final data set for Europe consisting of 5.7 million road and river segments. We have the slope for every line segment, and we assign travel speeds to all those line segments. So here it is. So if you're traveling on a river, you're relatively quick, and then as steeper as it gets, the slower you are, and any road with a higher angle than 45 degrees is considered a natural barrier. So so you have to go walk around a mountain, essentially. That's what it means. So this is our final travel network. So in red, you see again the border of Germany. The red triangles are the plague ports. The black dots are our cities. Blue is river segments, and brown are road segments. And this is the travel network that we use to calculate the travel time that it takes you to travel from the plague ports to the cities. So our identification strategy is essentially an intention to treat approach. So cities with a closer distance to those entering ports should experience more and as well more severe plague outbreaks. So they should experience, according to our theory, our hypothesis, the transition earlier. So our estimation framework thus is like this. So the year of demographic transition, we have our plague exposure, and we have a whole bunch of control variables. The same control variables as I already mentioned earlier. So here, this is our baseline results for the travel time on the year of demographic transition. So in the panel A on top, we only look at the travel time. And in panel B, we actually split the roads by roads that were on the Roman Empire and outside the Roman Empire, because some people suggest that the Romans were much better in building roads than following cultures. For us, it doesn't really matter that much. Both are highly significant throughout all specifications. The only issue that you have with splitting up Roman and non-Roman roads is that at some point your variance inflation factors tend to increase, but we're still fine in those specifications here. But later on, this might get a little problematic because you can only measure a certain amount of distances to certain places without them being collinear. Now let's talk a little bit about our IV strategy. So we can not only proxy the distance to the plague outbreaks, but the distance to the travel to the plague ports, we can also use the time that took you to travel from those ports to the cities as an instrument for how often you were hit by a plague outbreak. So relevance is, of course, it needs to be correlated with plague outbreaks, and the validity essentially here means that the measurement error in the plague data that we're trying to instrument should be uncorrelated with our travel time. And to me, it doesn't really seem plausible to be correlated with that. But if you have a different opinion, you can approach me later on, and we can discuss that. So here are our results. So if you look at the OLS column in panel A, this is what I showed you earlier. And in the next 4 columns, you see our IV estimates. So what this shows us is that OLS is biased towards 0 due to measurement error, but we still get significant results throughout all our specifications. So our different specifications here are for plague outbreaks in different time periods. So we can look at all plague outbreaks. We can look at the plague outbreaks between the year 0 and the year 1555, which was the Peace of Augsburg, which was the first peace treaty between Protestants and Catholics in Europe. It was shortly after the Reformation and much earlier than the 30-Year War and all the other major events that caused a lot of population movement. Okay, so it also works if we control for Roman and non-Roman roads. The F statistic goes a little down, but yeah. Okay, obviously you might wonder what effect trade has on that. Because after all, as I mentioned earlier, the plague gets spread via human contact, which includes trade for the most part. So what we can do is we can control for distance to Hanseatic cities, which were the main train hubs in medieval Europe, especially Germany, and we control for 19th century ports, which were not important during medieval times, so plague was not reintroduced through those, but those were only relevant for trade. And we have different specifications where we control for the closest 19th century port, the average distance to the 19th century port, and the closest Hanse, and we also do the combination of those. So when we look at that for panel A, for our travel time only without separating between Roman and non-Roman roads, our results are quite good. Also, the variance inflation factors only explode like dramatically when we go to the last column. I mean, essentially when we control for the closest Hanseatic city and the average distance to all 19th century ports, things become a little collinear. So you shouldn't really trust those results here, but all the other hint in the same direction. The same works for IV. So we're quite confident that we are picking something up here. I'm only looking here at the plague outbreaks between 0 and 1900. It works even better for the plague outbreaks between 0 and 1555, and 0 to 1618 before the 30-year war. But to be conservative, this is what I'm reporting here. Yes. So you might wonder, is that only true for Germany, or is there something more to it? So the general question about external validity. So we look at a second country. We do the same thing for France. And why are we interested in France? Well, first of all, France was the first country to experience a demographic transition. A lot of theories say that France essentially was the role model for the rest of Europe, and those are the reasons why we do that. Also because arguably the plague data is a little better for France. But even the French data is biased. But maybe French and German data are biased in different ways. So if we instrument across both data sets, we gain something. So first, let's just show you the results for France, the reduced form results where we proxy the travel time, proxy the plague outbreaks by the travel time. We still get significant results, with the only exception being the last column, where we include the coordinates. But since we control also for distance to Paris in France, because this is important for France, things obviously become collinear. Because if you travel to France, you can only measure a certain amount of travel times. And in panel B, you see the same regressions for Germany and France jointly, and all those results essentially go in the same direction, even controlling for all our control variables. Let's do the IV for Germany and France. So it works quite well for Germany, France, as well as pooled if you see panel A. If you look at panel B, it still works, but our F statistic is a little lower. So we are more convinced in using the regular travel time than splitting it up. Even though it would be nice to split it up, but this is again the problem with collinearity. Here we also do the same thing with controlling for trade. It still more or less works. I can also show you the results for 1555. Oh, they're not linked. All right, never mind. But it also works the same way. And, oh wait. Oh, sorry. No, that is just the pooled reduced form results. With that, it's not the IV. So it works here as well. And here, I can also do this for 0 to 1555 for our IV, for the pooled IV. So overall, I think I've shown a lot of evidence that I'm a little too early. All right, that usually happens to me. That I've shown a lot of evidence that there might be actually something to it, so that medieval plague shocks led to an earlier onset of the demographic transition. So we used OLS, we used a proxy as well as an IV approach. Our results are robust for Germany, France, pooled, and they're also robust for controlling for trade. And this is only just like a small fraction of what we actually do. We control for a whole bunch of stuff. We do this for 2 different data sets in Germany as far as demographic transition goes. We control for industry decompositions in Germany, which is only available for a subset. So we're not really showing that here. But the main takeaway message is that medieval plague shocks led to an earlier onset of demographic transition. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Thank you. Yes? Mm-hmm. I'm only using the number of plague outbreaks, mostly because the intensity is even less well measured than the number of plague outbreaks. It was easier for people to notice that people are dying, and much harder for them to realize how many people are actually dying. So data is much less reliable for that. Yep. The number of plague outbreaks. It probably instruments both, yes. Yeah, I mean, our instrument essentially captures both. So we're capturing the number of plague outbreaks, well, severity, so it's kind of hard to disentangle that. But it's definitely something we would like to do. So we actually also started doing that at some point, but we had to give up on that because the data on how many people actually died is not widely available. So for Germany, there were only, I think it was 32 observations out of our 237 cities. And if you instrument something with 32 observations, that doesn't really help you a lot. Also, it's much less well measured. Okay. Yeah, we look at, so what we control for, let me just go back to one where we see that. So what we control for in population is the log population before the plague outbreaks and the population growth between 14 and 1500. Because this is where we have the data availability for Germany as well as France. I'm not sure if there's much more we can do. There is, because data needs to be available for both Germany as well as France if we want to do the pooled stuff. But if you have any ideas, sorry, didn't really get that population of the young population. Okay. Okay, so we do control for the age composition at the time of the demographic transition by using Hutterite fertilities. We can't really control for the share of the population in medieval times, also because we don't really know at what time they were hit by the plague outbreaks. And so we do control for it in the 19th century, but not in medieval times. Because you could think that younger people have a higher survival probability of the plague because they are more robust or for whatever reason. Unfortunately, we can't really control for that. Yes?
Another question about control. So you say control for institutions.
Yeah.
Sounds like a sensible thing to do, but what does that actually mean in practice?
What it means is whether a city had a university, whether it was part of the Hanseatic League, whether they had a printing press, and whether it was considered a free imperial city. Those are the control variables that we have.
Because to me that also, it seems like something that's sensible to control for, but could also be potential mechanisms.
Could be.
Places that are hit by the plague become more urbanized and then develop these more progressive institutions. Is that something you could look into?
We could look into that, I guess. Yes, we could check that.
Maybe then also drawing a transition. These places are,
Yes.
in a sense, more in line.
Yeah. So I mean, we're already controlling for it, but it might be like a channel to look at that. Yeah.
See the direct effect on institutions.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, so sorry. Maybe ladies first. All right. Mm-hmm. No. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have done that. The problem is that at some point our so the over-identification test tells us that we should only use one instrument. But we definitely have done that and checked that. So in the paper, we present all specifications in the appendix and essentially let people decide what they choose to believe. But for the sake of the shortness of the presentation, I've only reported those. F statistic tends to go a little higher, I believe, if you include more stuff. Also, if you include the number of plague ports within a certain amount of hours that you travel, So we've checked how many plague boats can be reached within 100 hours. You can add that, and it helps improve the effort testing a little bit. Yeah. There was one more question. The demographic, yeah, okay.
In water and wetland, all you need is a population fall to move to higher growth regime, right? And that's just all you need is a high mortality regime to persist over time through different issues like wars or urbanization. But they don't say much about how the demographic transition happens.
No, they have.
You don't say much either. So I was just going to push you a little bit on
Yeah.
why wouldn't people just try to go back to previous population level as soon as the plague ends?
As soon as the plague ends, well, the footnote 4 story essentially tells us that they stay at a higher Malthusian level. It doesn't really tell us a lot about demographic transition, yes. And this is where we also don't claim that this goes directly into demographic transition. It just essentially sets the stage. So you have higher population density, you have higher urbanization, and over time, those factors lead to the demographic transition. It's not the plague outbreaks itself, it's more that the plague outbreaks lead to urbanization, which essentially sets the stage for the onset. It's not that you get hit by the plague and decide to have fewer children. It's more like an aggregate effect over time. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. How much time do we have left? Okay. Okay, last question. Yeah? The first one, this one here?
Next, one where you have the questions.
Yeah. Wait. All right.
So how many of your observations, the closest port is not on
Very few. Some in the south. The closest one is Venice in far travel time, but those are very few. For most of them, it's one of like Danzig or Hamburg. Is the closest one. Yeah, well, if it would be like just north-south, then that would be captured by latitude, longitude, right? Because we're controlling for that as well. So it seems to be more than just north-south. It seems to be actually the time it takes you to travel there, rather than the simple north-south divide. But yeah, we have also checked that, yeah. Because this is like what really usually comes to mind first, yeah. Thank you. All right, thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Bishnu and Fabian, for excellent presentations. Apologies for doing a terrible job chairing, but in my defense, this room is a bit intimidating. So also apologies to Eric, who sat through the exact same presentation just over a week ago. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'm looking at, my title has changed somewhat to reflect where the project stands. And the question I'm looking at is essentially a very well-trodden one. It's definitely not new. I'm interested in analyzing whether historical institutions can have persistent effects on economic development. What I'm going to use to test this hypothesis is what I'm going to claim is the quasi-random assignment of villages in colonial India in 1801 to two very different land tenure systems, and I'll explain how some villages were essentially assigned to landlords and others were assigned to the government. Because I have villages and I'm able to focus on a small geographical area, I can use the geographical RDD approach. And my results indicate that villages that were historically under landlords have substantially lower development as proxied by literacy rates, public good provision, and the proportion of irrigated land in a village than those that were directly managed by the government. Now, again, this is not a new result. So the paper in the field, Banerjee and Iyer 2005, does an all-India study where they found that districts that were assigned to landlords had much lower agricultural productivity, much lower public good provision in post-independent India. But hopefully I'll be able to convince you that this study adds something to the existing literature. Which is, the first point there is that one of the critiques of this Banerjee and Iyer research has been that the way they classify landlord and non-landlord districts across the country is somewhat controversial, and their results have been shown to be sensitive to sort of reclassifications. And essentially what it comes down to is the actual agrarian relations on the ground were very complicated. So a landlord in the north of India need not necessarily have been the same as a landlord in the south of India. I'm able to bypass this entirely because I focus on a very small area, so I'm able to clearly define what the relations hopefully are in this area. Okay, the second advantage my research has is methodological. I don't need to use an IV, I'm able to use an RDD, so I don't have to sort of grapple with the exclusion restriction to try to prove specifically that geography, which is increasingly be shown even in the Indian context to be important, that geography is essentially not playing a role here. Okay, and finally, while most other studies look at district-level data, I'm able to look at village-level data, so hopefully my findings will have some implications for rural development in particular. Cool, okay. So the historical background. And this is a painting which depicts a scene that took place in 1767, where essentially the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam is giving the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa to Robert Clive, who's the director of the East India Company. What I always point out about this picture, it's really fascinating, is that it's very, very stylized. This is not how it went down. Shah Alam has just been defeated in war. He does not want to do this. This actually took place on the outskirts of the Indian city of Allahabad, probably outside a tent in the middle of nowhere. But instead, it's this sort of court setting. And if you look really closely, that building in the background looks suspiciously like St. Paul's. So it's definitely partly fictional, but depicting a very real event. So why is this important? Because this is the first time the company now has to grapple with this land revenue problem. How do you maximize consistent revenue collections? And remember, at this time, the East India Company is a really, really small entity. And what they devise as the simplest and easiest immediate solution is we're going to identify existing chiefs and intermediaries wherever we can, tell them to collect taxes on our behalf, and as long as they pay a certain amount to us every year, they get to maintain control over these lands in perpetuity. So that's what they've done. They fixed their revenue obligations, and this was called the permanent settlement because it was permanent. And one of the things that the British realized soon enough was that this might not be ideal, but the courts simply said, I mean, this is legally irreversible. You can't do anything about this. Okay, so this was the official policy of the government 1793 onwards. Right, so this is a map from 1785, and essentially you see red, you see Bengal on the top over there, and that's where the permanent settlement was first introduced in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. But what starts happening towards the end of the 18th century is that the British are getting control of more and more of South India. And this is where this official policy starts being challenged. And one of sort of the major figures in this resistance, in this challenge to permanently giving land rights to landlords is Thomas Munro, who says essentially that we proceed in a country of which we know little or nothing as if we knew everything. We feel our ignorance of Indian revenue and the difficulties arising from it, but instead of seeking to remedy it by acquiring more knowledge, we try to get rid of the difficulty by making permanent settlements. So he's essentially a huge critic of giving landlords permanent rights to these lands. Of course, this is the nice explanation for his motivations. There's also some people who argue he was a military guy. He didn't like the idea of small landlords ruling bits and pieces of the country, even though the British had nominally had control. Whatever the reason, he basically starts experimenting himself when he's the collector in the South with an alternative system, which involves not using intermediaries, and the government goes into each and every village, marks out each and every piece of land, and makes contracts directly with the cultivator. So revenue settled by a field-by-field basis, and therefore the alternative is a cultivator-based system. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in to my study area, which is around here, land that the British got under control in 1801, basically at the turn of the 19th century. And what you'll see is essentially there's a district on the left, which is Kadapa, and a district on the right, which is Nellore. So on the right, the collector who is appointed, the official in charge of the district, Mr. Travers, very obediently sort of obeys government policy and settles land with the existing landlords. So for example, there's a landlord in the Venkatagiri estate, and all the villages in this estate are settled with this landlord. But in the district on the left, which is Kadapa, the collector who's appointed is no one but Thomas Munro, the guy I was talking about, the guy who was really, really against the permanent settlement. So going against the wishes and the official policy at that time, and there's evidence that people are really, really angry with Thomas Munro. They're saying, these kings, these landlords are our friends, you can't get rid of them, the policy is we need to settle land with them. Going against official policy, he gets rid of the 51 landlords who exist in Kadapa, gets rid by basically either pensioning them off or hanging them, such that there are no landlords then on the left of this boundary. So essentially what you get is, of this historical boundary, on the right, you get villages that were settled under a landlord, where the cultivators pay a landlord who pays the government. And on the left, you get villages that were settled directly with the government, where the cultivators directly paid tax revenue to the government. And one of the nice things for my study is that this is essentially now a historical boundary. Both these areas are now in post-independent India, part of the same district, so are following the same policies and affected by the same administrators and so on. Okay. This is just to say that this process, so Thomas Munro himself then became the governor of Madras in 1821. And the British administrators very quickly changed their minds about the merits of this cultivator-based system, simply because they realized they could get more money out of it. So they realized, actually, no, it's kind of good. So what happened essentially after that was this became, instead of permanently settling with landlords, the official policy changed, and Thomas Munro was at the spearhead of this, spearheaded this change, such that in the Madras province, 2/3 was settled under a cultivator-based system, and what was already settled with landlords sort of had to be left like that. And then you also had the Bombay Presidency, which was also settled with cultivators. Okay. So this is just summarizing what I've said so far. What impacts would we expect? Well, one of the things was the landlord villages' rights of the tenants were not clearly defined. So the British did a very clear job of, okay, this landlord has to pay us this amount. That's fine, but how much the landlord could extract from the tenants and how much the tenants could extract from the subtenants was not defined. It was particularly hard to measure because of lack of records, but also because in these villages, often there were very customary ways of collecting revenue rather than sort of a clear-cut, well-defined title deed. So there's also evidence, historical evidence, that landlord villages had 4 to 5 times higher revenue. So peasants had to pay 4 to 5 times higher revenue in landlord villages. Instead, in government villages, you see revenues, tax revenues reduced and then regularized. You see their title deeds for each field of land, which leads to development of a market in land. And you also have an annual settlement process whereby essentially every year the administrator of the district goes and sets up a tent outside all the villages. All the cultivators come to show them how much they've grown, what they've grown, how much land they've used, and based on this, they pay a fixed amount of tax. And if there's a drought, for example, in this case, the administrator can excuse provide some remissions on the tax revenue. Okay, this also leads to different outcomes. So there's historical evidence that if people could run from landlord villages, they did. So there is significant out-migration from landlord villages to government villages. There's also reports that if you can't run, well, they tried fighting, so there's higher conflict in landlord villages compared to non-landlord villages. So what you see is essentially landlords, given this legal confusion, not only do you try to extract as much as possible, but they also tend to give up on sort of the customary obligations in terms of forest rights, irrigation, which again leads to more conflict in these villages. Well, and if you can't run and you can't fight, you just stayed and sort of suffered. So the structure of these villages changed such that these villages were smaller and more unequal. Okay. Coming to my data and strategy. What I did was I digitized a village-level census from colonial India and matched individual villages to their entry in a 2001 census. This was the main reason this was tricky was because, firstly, there could be 10 villages which have exactly the same name. So you need to match, and there's no IDs, of course, that you can match. So you had to figure out which one matches which, and then the spellings were a mess. But anyway, so that's what I did there. And I also used historical records to plot railway stations and historically important towns. I created all sorts of geographical variables for altitude, slope, and soil. Yeah. Okay, so I hope I've made a reasonably convincing case that there was some sort of an exogenous assignment across my sample boundary, across this historical boundary, such that some villages that came under Thomas Munro just had now direct contracts with the government, whereas the others were settled with the landlord. The second thing that's important is I need to show all predetermined variables very smoothly across this historical boundary. Now, this is where some data limitations are important to emphasize, because remember, I said this initial assignment of land tenures took place in 1801. But the first data I have at the village level, in terms of population and other sort of characteristics, is in 1901. So technically, in my model, the only predetermined variables are the geographical variables. Everything else could have been assigned, so could have been influenced by the assignment of land tenure in 1801. But I'm going to include some controls anyway, even though they might technically be bad controls, just to show you that those are not the channels through which this effect persists. Okay, anyway, so this is altitude across my historical boundary. And the idea is there might be a small part where the altitude drops across the historical boundary, but largely you see there's no significant difference here and here. Similarly for slope, this is routing conditions is one of the components that I put into my soil variable. So it's not very bright, but that just shows it's exactly the same soil routing conditions across the boundary. There's a hill range over here, which means that soil quality is lower. This is a variable for proportion of lower costs in a village. So now this is one of those variables that I was talking about, which is could be a bad control, because you could have a situation where the out-migration is selective in that actually the lower costs are the ones who can't run away from the landlord villages. And that's partly supported by there being a higher proportion of lower costs in landlord villages compared to government villages. Okay, this is literacy, which is one of my outcome variables. The drop across the boundary is clearer if you look at this RD plot. And I finally also do some sort of tests across 4 sections of the boundary. Okay. So this is my model, simple enough. Literacy or proportion of irrigated land in a village is my outcome variable. This is the treatment, whether a village was assigned to a landlord. These are my controls. I also control for different sort of polynomials of geography. Okay. This is the same map as I showed you earlier, except I've plotted the railway line that I use across my study area. The nice thing here is that railways themselves could be endogenous to land tenure, because the government sometimes found it really hard to get land from the landlords. Railways tended to sort of navigate around these estates, but in this case, this railway line sort of crisscrosses my study area, which is nice. Okay, results. So these are my main results, where in column 1, so I have always four samples within 5 kilometers of the boundary, within 10, within 15, and within 20. In the first column, I have absolutely no controls. In the second, I include just the geographical controls, which technically, as I argued, are the only ones which I can be sure are predetermined. So that's my first baseline. And then in the third and the fourth, I also include controls for distance to the nearest railway station, distance to the nearest town. And here I include additional controls, proportion of agricultural laborers, proportion of lower costs. And this sort of fourth column becomes my second baseline, where I include all the controls I have so far. As you can see, there's quite a significant and substantial impact on literacy in villages. So this is 2001 literacy that is much, much lower in villages that were assigned to a landlord in 1801. Given my average literacy in the sample is around 40%, this is quite, I think, meaningful result. One of the issues here possibly is because, here I'm just using distance to the boundary as a running variable, but given its a geographical setting, I also experiment with sort of different specifications. So that's my first baseline as I had it in the previous table, but I also use quadratic to distance, linear and interaction, linear and coordinates, so latitude and longitude, and a quadratic in coordinates. And results are largely robust. Okay, this is for the second baseline, again with all the different variations in geographical controls. I find very, very similar results for irrigation, which I'm not going to show here to save time. I also run a series of probit models to show that villages in 2001 that were historically assigned to a landlord have lower probability of having a middle school, high school, medical facility, bus route, and a post office. So this is where I exploit the railways. So initially, one of my hypotheses was that perhaps railways will just be beneficial to all villages. But what it seems like is railways is actually a channel that, so what you see is distance from station is generally always negative, which implies the closer the village is to a station, the better it is, the higher the literacy is. But if you look at the interaction of being a landlord village with the distant station, that turns positive, such that actually it seems like the landlord villages are not benefiting from the railways. This is where I throw in what I consider definitely to be a bad control. So as I said, there was out-migration historically. Sadly, I don't have population data from 1801, so I can't use that as a control. But this is my first baseline, this is my second baseline, and in columns 2 and 4, I throw in population in 1901 as a control. And what you see is my results get weaker, but they don't completely disappear. So it seems like population may be one of the channels, but it's not the only one. Okay, this is the final slide I will show of the results. So one of the nice things about the irrigation data is that I can disentangle what type of irrigation these villages have. And what you find is actually the result seems to be driven very strongly by the proportion of irrigated area that's irrigated by tube wells. And this is interesting because tube wells is something that really sort of expanded, the technology really spread during the Green Revolution. So it seems like there might be some long-lasting impacts of this historical land tenure that made some villages, sort of the landlord villages, less likely to take advantage of agricultural technologies in the future. And that's something I'm looking at right now. Okay, I'm going to skip over the robustness, but come back to it if people have questions. To conclude, my results seem to indicate that colonial institutions do seem to have persistent impacts. But what I'm working on right now is how we can explore these impacts, specifically since these land tenures were finally abolished after 1947, when India got independence. And there I'm trying to look at the differential success of the land reforms in different areas, the impact of the Green Revolution, as I said, and the potential for democratic capture at the village level. Thank you. Questions? Yeah. No, so the revenues for the government are higher actually in the government-managed areas because they can adjust the revenues, and they do this over time. But what I was sort of talking about in the difference between the villages is that the actual cultivators seem to be paying much higher revenues in the landlord villages. Yes, no, that's a very good, and I think I should explore that further into actually where this money is being spent as well and how it's being spent. Yeah. Yes, yes, there are. So what happened was so the argument was, okay, these landlords, as long as these landlords exist, we want to settle property rights with them. But if these landlords have gifted some villages to kin or to someone else in the past, those we take back. So these are sort of a third type of land tenure, which sort of Enam villages, essentially, which used to be just gifted away, and then they came under government control, which is why you have some on the right-hand side. So I've played around, I think I want to do more analysis of just comparing them to their neighbors on this side. But in terms of them having an impact, I've excluded them, I've included them. It doesn't seem to make a difference. I think, Eric? Okay. Yes. Yeah. And the second?
And the most effective one is as to why railways could be a mechanism that kind of works for effect. And is that because it sort of worsens the selective outmigration? That now that the more railway access, the good people are more likely to outmigrate? Is that something you can look at?
Yeah, so the first answer is because this 2001 data on public goods comes from a completely different sample, and there I wasn't able to merge as many as I did for the previous. The results just didn't converge. It's not hiding anything. The second answer is absolutely. I think selective migration is one of the potential ways in which I can sort of think about the railways result. The other comes from historical evidence just of landlords being very resistant to sort of cultivators growing cash crops, trying to take advantage of sort of this commercialization of agriculture because they saw it as a challenge to their authority almost. And yeah, so I think, yes. Okay, yeah. So you mean to look at literacy rates by caste, for example? No, absolutely. I think that's a very good point. Sadly, at the village level, I don't have data of literacy by caste. No, no, no. Yeah.
Kind of related to this question that there could be something, you're looking at literacy levels, recently.
Yeah.
And why should we expect the state level policies not to have any impact, which kind of, pulls up people who are behind to begin with? So is there any way you can look at literacy in 31 or 51, where you can then spread them in your algorithm saying there were these differences? Or it could be that the composition of the population is totally different, and one is lower caste, less aspirational, and didn't really get put at, so that's a different challenge, I think. So I think those are important questions to kind of...
Yes, absolutely. And ideally, what I'd like to do is have literacy in 1931 and 1941. That's definitely not available. At the village level, I haven't found. In fact, I mean, the village level census existed, as far as I was aware, in the British Library only for Madras, only for 1891 and 1901, which also didn't have literacy, but it just has the sort of basic characteristics. And then 1941, but that was incomplete. But what I want to do is try to get 1951 and 61, because I've heard that does exist, so village census does exist, and there should be literacy, and that would be really, really interesting to see whether divergence happens after that or before. Yeah. Yes, so that's what I actually show when I was looking at public goods. So I use the village amenities survey, essentially, where it seems like there is an impact on middle schools and high schools. But for primary schools, actually, I found there's just not enough variation in the data because every village now seems to have a primary school. So which is why I'm restricted to only using middle schools and high schools. I think I need to be clear about this, but there's one sort of demand side channel which comes from the side that these villages are poorer, they have perhaps lower aspirations, they have lower demand for education. And then there's also a supply side channel where historically landlords were very, very reluctant, particularly to provide primary education. Yeah. Okay, maybe we can, okay, last one. Yeah, so they became, that's one of the slight problems, they became one district in 1970. So there is this period after independence where there were two different districts. So that's one of the sort of issues.
That's the thing that kind of screws with my head. You know, if there was still a boundary there, like it seems so much more intuitive why there would still be huge differences. Because policies can also still differ across, right? You know, but like if they're all eating the same thing, it almost seems like it has to be a selection effect of who is living where.
Right. Yeah, no, so as I said, I mean, sadly, I don't have a way to actually quantify the selection effect, but it's definitely part of the story. The way I tried to rule out, yeah, no, it's not quite because I don't have the compositions, but it's not just the population differences, as I showed. Okay, so this is not correctly answering your question. Anyway, thank you. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Yeah, I could do that. I should do that. Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you, everyone. We can wrap up the session.